Patrick Wallace came home to find his fence bulldozed by a power-hungry HOA chairwoman, Patricia Henderson. She thought she could get away with her petty tyranny, but Patrick had other plans. You won't believe how he turned the tables and brought her reign crashing down. You know that sinking feeling when you pull into your driveway and something's off? Yeah, that was me last Friday. I'd just gotten home from work. Traffic had been the usual nightmare, and I was daydreaming about crashing on the couch with a cold drink. But as I turned the corner onto my street, I slammed on the brakes so hard my coffee went flying. My fence, my beautiful white picket fence, gone. No, not missing, gone. Obliterated. In its place was a mangled mess of splintered wood, tire tracks, and a bright orange sign that screamed, "Violation removed by HOA." What violation? I jumped out of my car, still clutching my keys, and stomped over to the sign, hoping I'd misread it. Nope. Right there, in all caps, was the smug declaration, "Non-compliant structure, removed per community regulations." Non-compliant. That fence has been there since I bought the house 7 years ago. And it wasn't just any fence. It was my fence, the one I'd sanded and painted myself, the one that kept my dog, Max, from sprinting into traffic every time a squirrel looked at him funny. I stood there, jaw clenched, surveying the wreckage. And that's when it hit me. Someone had brought a bulldozer into my yard, flattened my property, and left without so much as a courtesy call. The first call I made was to HOA headquarters. "Hi, this is Patrick Wallace. Can someone explain to me why my fence is now a pile of rubble in my front yard?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. A pause. Then a crisp, almost robotic reply. "Please hold." When they finally transferred me to the HOA chairwoman, Patricia Henderson, I let out a breath, trying to stay civil. "Miss Henderson," I began, "I just got home to find my fence removed," she cut in. Her tone was ice cold. "Your fence was non-compliant. It exceeded the height restrictions outlined in our community handbook. You should have received notice." "Notice?" I repeated, my voice rising. "There was no notice, and even if there had been, you didn't have the right to just demolish it." She sniffed. "Your fence was half an inch too tall. That's a violation. We acted in accordance with policy." Half an inch. Half. An inch. I felt my blood pressure spike as she went on, lecturing me about aesthetics and uniformity. But all I could hear was the sound of her smug tone, like she was enjoying this. By the time I hung up, I was shaking with anger. My fence wasn't just a fence. It was my property, my hard work, and my right as a homeowner. And Patricia Henderson? She was going to regret thinking she could bulldoze over me, both literally and figuratively. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about my fence anymore. It was about the principle. What gave Patricia Henderson and her HOA minions the right to act like little dictators in our neighborhood? Half an inch? Really? I couldn't let it go. The next morning, fueled by bad coffee and barely contained rage, I started digging. I went door to door, asking my neighbors if they'd had any run-ins with HOA lately. At first, most of them hesitated. No one wants to be the person who rocks the boat, especially when the boat belongs to Patricia Henderson. But then my neighbor Mark, retired Marine, owner of the loudest motorcycle on the block, opened up. "Oh, they've been gunning for you," he said, leaning against his garage door. "She's had it out for you ever since that community vote last year." The vote, of course. I'd opposed her ridiculous plan to hike HOA dues for a neighborhood beautification project that, let's be honest, was just a fancy way of saying, let's plant some overpriced roses in front of the clubhouse. Apparently, she didn't take kindly to losing. Mark wasn't the only one with stories. By the time I finished my rounds, I had a list of grievances longer than my grocery receipts. There was Sarah, 2 streets over, who'd been fined $500 for painting her front door the wrong shade of blue. And Joe, who'd been forced to tear down his garden shed because it didn't match the architectural theme of the neighborhood. But the worst? The Wilsons. They'd built a treehouse for their kids, a simple, harmless treehouse, and HOA made them tear it down because, get this, it violated airspace restrictions. Airspace. In a suburban neighborhood. It wasn't just me. Patricia Henderson was running the HOA like her own private kingdom, and the rest of us were just peasants trying to stay out of her crosshairs. That's when I decided it was time to fight back. But first, I needed to know exactly how far she'd gone. I tracked down the demolition crew that had bulldozed my fence. They were a local company, and one of the workers, a guy named Eddie, was surprisingly forthcoming. "We got a call from the HOA chair," he said, lowering his voice like he was about to share a state secret. "She told us it was an emergency removal and gave us the green light. Said we'd be fined if we didn't do it right away." "An emergency? My fence was an emergency?" Eddie went on. "She was standing there the whole time barking orders. Told us to make sure there wasn't a single piece left standing. Kept saying something about setting an example." Setting an example. That's what this was. Patricia didn't care about rules or community guidelines. She cared about power, about making sure everyone knew she was in charge. By the time Eddie finished talking, I wasn't just angry. I was furious. This wasn't just petty HOA politics anymore. This was personal. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was on a mission. Patricia Henderson thought she could bulldoze my fence, my property, my rights, not on my watch. First, I went through every HOA rulebook, guideline, and amendment I could get my hands on. You know what I found? Half the violations Patricia had been enforcing weren't even real. The handbook said fences couldn't exceed 6 feet in height. Mine was 5.5. Well within the limit. But Patricia's game wasn't about rules. It was about control. So I decided to hit her where it hurt, her image. Patricia loved to parade around as the perfect HOA chairwoman, throwing barbecues, handing out newsletters, smiling in every photo like she was the queen of suburbia. But behind the curtain, she was running the HOA like a mob boss, and I had proof. I started with Eddie's testimony about the demolition. With his permission, I recorded a statement. She told us to tear it down as an emergency, but there was no emergency. She just wanted to send a message. Next, I gathered statements from my neighbors. Mark talked about her vendetta against anyone who opposed her. Sarah handed me copies of her fine notices for her so-called door violation. The Wilsons even had photos of their kids' demolished treehouse. But the real kicker? The HOA budget. Thanks to a friendly board member who'd had enough of Patricia's antics, I got access to financial records. Guess who'd approved a $5,000 landscaping project for her own backyard, disguised as a community improvement? Yep, Patricia. Armed with my evidence, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. Then I took it one step further. I sued. Not just for the cost of my fence, but for damages, harassment, and unauthorized destruction of property. At the hearing, Patricia showed up looking smug, like she thought this was just another speed bump on her road to HOA tyranny. But her confidence didn't last long. My lawyer didn't waste any time. He started with the fence, showing the photos, measurements, and Eddie's recorded statement. Patricia tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced her with a sharp glare. Then came the neighbors' testimonies. One by one, they described how Patricia had targeted them, fined them, and destroyed their property. By the time Sarah finished talking about her illegal blue door, Patricia's smug grin had turned into a tight-lipped scowl. But the final blow, the financial records. When the judge saw the $5,000 landscaping expense, she leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Nay, Miss Henderson, can you explain why HOA funds were used for what appears to be private property improvements?" Patricia stammered, her face turning red. Those were community-approved." "Really?" My lawyer cut in. "Because I have 10 homeowners here who say otherwise." By the time we adjourned, Patricia looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. The judge ordered her to pay restitution for my fence, along with a hefty fine for misusing HOA funds. She also recommended that the board remove her as chairwoman, effective immediately. Patricia Henderson didn't stand a chance. After the hearing, word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The woman who had ruled over us with an iron fist was finally dethroned. It was like a collective weight had been lifted. I couldn't step outside without someone stopping me to shake my hand or pat me on the back. "You're a hero, Patrick," Sarah said, grinning as she handed me a fresh batch of cookies. "I hope she's crying into her designer throw pillows right now." Turns out, she was. 2 days after the hearing, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to strip Patricia of her position as chairwoman. By the end of the week, She'd resigned from the board entirely, retreating into her oversized house like a disgraced monarch. But the best part? Seeing her forced to personally cut me a check for my fence. I made a point of inviting a few neighbors over when she dropped it off. She pulled up in her shiny black SUV, wearing sunglasses so big they practically covered her face, and stepped out like she was walking to her own execution. "Here," she muttered, shoving the envelope into my hand. "This settles it." I glanced inside. It wasn't just for the cost of the fence. The court-ordered restitution, legal fees, and punitive damages had turned it into a 5-figure sum. I couldn't help myself. I smiled. "Thanks, Patricia. I'll make sure it goes to good use. Maybe I'll add a fountain to my yard, for the community beautification project." She didn't reply, just turned on her heel, climbed back into her car, and sped off down the street. Replacing the fence felt like a victory lap. I hired a crew to build a new one, this time even taller than the old one, just to make a point. I made sure the design was HOA compliant, of course, wouldn't want to break any rules. The neighbors pitched in to help landscape the yard around it. Someone even suggested painting a mural on the inside of the fence with all our names, as a reminder of what we'd accomplished together. But the true victory wasn't just the fence. It was the change in the neighborhood. Without Patricia breathing down our necks, people started to come together in ways they hadn't before. Barbecues were friendlier, HOA meetings were calmer, and for the first time in years, the community actually felt like, well, a community. And me? Every time I see that new fence, I feel a little burst of satisfaction. It's more than just wood and paint. It's a symbol, a reminder that even the biggest bullies can be brought down, as long as you're willing to stand your ground. So, to anyone out there dealing with an HOA dictator, don't give up. Fight back. Sometimes, justice is just one bulldozed fence away.